Meantime, a grim new state report is uncovering a dark truth about the rise of domestic violence here in Nebraska.
Yeah, the Nebraska Domestic Abuse Death Review Team released its annual report, which shows a sharp spike in deaths. First Alert 6's Danielle Schenk is at the alert desk with a breakdown of these stunning numbers. Danielle?
Brian and Jacqueline, the numbers in this report are as staggering as they are heartbreaking. Last year, Nebraska saw 30 domestic abuse-related deaths. That's more than the 2 prior years combined, with at least 5 occurring in Omaha. Since the Death Review Team was created in 2022, investigators have identified 89 total domestic abuse deaths across the state. The report also shines a light on how children were impacted. 32 were present when a parent or caregiver was murdered. 10 kids were killed by a family member, but the most critical gap found in this study, of the cases reviewed, only 1 victim had contact with a domestic violence program in the year before their death. Yet family members knew about the prior abuse in 74% of cases, and friends knew in 65%. To help close that gap, the Attorney General's office is launching a free virtual training series covering a variety of domestic abuse-related topics. The first session is in late October. Meanwhile, the grim trend continues. So far this year, we've reported on at least 3 domestic violence-related deaths in Omaha. Reporting at the Alert Desk, I'm Danielle Schenk, First Alert 6.